You're listening to the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast, brought to you by BuildTurbines.com. Learn, train, and be a part of the clean energy revolution. Visit BuildTurbines.com today. Now here's your hosts, Alan Hall, Joel Saxum, Phil Totaro, and Rosemary Barnes.
Well, welcome to the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast. I am Alan Hall, and I'm here with Rosemary Barnes, who's fresh from Sweden. She just traveled all around the world to record this episode. Phil Totaro is out in California, and Joel Saxum is up in the cold north of Wisconsin. And we've been just discussing off air all the craziness that's been happening in the wind industry. And I have to admit, I thought last week was insane. Well, we just put it on steroids. So not only are we canceling a lot of projects in the United States currently, we're starting to cancel them in Australia. And over in Queensland, the Queensland Deputy Premier has used his ministerial powers to refuse planning approval for the Moonlight Range wind farm near Rockhampton. Now, I'm sure I murdered that name, Rosemary, so please forgive me. But it was going to have 88 turbines and about 450 megawatts of capacity, enough to power about 250,000 homes in Australia. And tied with it is about 300 construction jobs and 10 permanent positions to make that wind farm go. But was like a 2-month public consultation period that happened. And during that consultation period, about 90% of the local residents, and when I say local residents, there are about 150 local residents, replied back and were concerned about some of the number of people that are going to be there. It's going to double the population, right? And 300 construction workers in an area of 140 people, 150 people. And based on that, boom, the project was canceled. What is happening in Queensland that we need to understand that projects just kind of get wiped away like that with 140 people, 150 people chiming in?
So what's happened is that the Queensland state government, it was Labor for quite a while, and they had renewables targets and net zero targets and stuff like that. And then the government changed last year. So now there's a Liberal government, which means Conservative in Australia. They're in power, and they wanted to change the planning regulations. But what is a bit weird is that they want to do it retroactively. So they've changed the rules in April, and now they're going through projects that have already been approved to see if they meet the new rules rather than the rules at the time that they were approved. But the weirdest thing is that I'm pretty sure that this specific wind farm that they revoked, they were the ones to approve it. Shortly after they came into government, they approved this wind farm, and then they changed the rules a few months later, and then they did a new round of community consultation. And they say that 85% of local residents were, in favor of reassessing. The issue is that now we're at this stage of the energy transition where, we're up over 40% renewables across Australia. That's primarily wind and solar. And we're getting to the point now where you can't just add things as they're convenient and easy. You have to get a bit more strategic, think about the whole energy system. I was looking forward to that coming online because it will make the whole system more robust and less fluctuations. It would really even things out quite a lot to have a lot of that Queensland wind in the mix. So it will be a real shame and a problem for the whole of the Australian East Coast grid if Queensland opts out of any more wind energy.
But once they approve these plans, it's sort of, you have to think about the grid as an entity, and unplugging some capacity there does have consequences further down the transmission line in this case.
Yeah, but each state has responsibility. They're interconnected, but each state has responsibility that they are going to be okay regardless of what. They can't control what the other states do. So yeah, every state has to make sure that they are okay on their own, and they are planning for that. So yeah, like Victoria's got a lot of plans for batteries and interconnectors and stuff, and New South Wales is building renewable energy zones. Everyone's got their own plans moving ahead. It would have made the whole job easier, but like any interconnector interconnection between two grids, you can't you plan for it, but you have to also plan for the scenario where that interconnection goes down, or whatever reason you might not get the energy that you plan on from the other states. So it is a tricky aspect, I think, of planning.
Rosemary, let me ask you a question, and this is popping into my head right now because basically political games between parties and these kind of things. And normally we don't talk politics on the show, and we try to stay away from that. And I'm going to skirt it. But a couple months ago, when I was down, I was invited to testify at the Texas Senate, and I was amazed at the lack of technical knowledge in the room. Right, there's these people they're putting bills forward, they're doing things that really affect the general populace, but their knowledge base is coming from like their chief of staff, and their chief of staff is a political science major, and that person is just Googling whatever they want to see in the bill. So they're putting things out that just didn't make sense, right? When it comes to Australian politics, is it the same kind of stuff? Is it more of just like these political arguments versus the technical ones? Or how do they get information into these decisions? Because this decision to me just seems like it seems like it's not based in scientific fact or a scientific method around anything. It's just like, oh, we don't like these things, let's get rid of them.
Yeah, I don't think it's trying to be based. They're not. They're not. Even the government is not trying to say that it's based on any kind of science or anything. They're saying that they're mostly citing things like community consultation. So it's more about people's feelings, which is a valid thing. I was listening to a podcast about Texas. Actually, I'm halfway through it still. About what's going on there with some of their proposals to require everybody to have 100% firming for each individual project. And I do think that Texas is trying really hard to, you got a pretty flexible system and allow companies to make their own decisions about how, what kind of energy sources they're going to have and how they're going to make money, and let the market take care of it to a certain extent. And it's really similar to the Australian electricity market as well. They do share a common basis, and some of the same people worked on the market design of both of them. But I feel like Texas is trying as hard as possible to intervene to make sure that you can get none of the benefits and all of the disadvantages of a system like that. So that is a bit interesting.
But at some point, Rosemary, and maybe we'll talk about this after the break. Maybe that's the thing to do, is to talk about this after the break. It takes so long to get projects approved because of the interconnect that the engineers have to go back and look, make sure if this is going to work. How do they connect this energy source into the grid? How do they make it work? In the United States, and I want to get over the break here, I want to talk to Phil about this. We spend all this time doing the engineering work, and then all of a sudden, poof, it's gone. What is the point of doing all the engineering if at a moment's notice you can yank this project?
Don't let blade damage catch you off guard. Eologic's ping sensors detect issues before they become expensive, time-consuming problems. From ice buildup and lightning strikes to vibrations and internal cracks, Eologic's ping has you covered. Their cutting-edge sensors are easy to install, giving you the power to easily stop damage before it's too late. Visit eologicsping.com and take control of your turbine's health today.
Phil, explain what is happening on the interconnect and why it takes so long to get projects approved, and all of the supposedly because of engineering, it takes a long time to understand what effect of adding 500 megawatts will do to a grid. And then instantaneously, you just delete a project. Doesn't that really affect all the work that the engineering just completed and spent all that time doing? It's not, you just can't plug 500 megawatts into a grid willy-nilly. You have to plan for it. But to delete a project has like cascading problems, right?
I think you also just kind of answered your own question regarding what's the challenge here. It's, if you want to add 5 megawatts to a grid, that's a lot easier to integrate because the grid can probably handle it. It was a little bit over-designed. But when you start talking about adding or subtracting 500 megawatts plus at a time, and there are terawatts worth of solar projects that have been proposed, obviously they're all not going to get built. But when you've got that volume in the interconnection queue, every single one of those has to be independently studied, and then every single one of those, the how each one goes together and the impact of one on the other and the whole system, that all needs to go together. Originally, the way that things were being permitted for interconnection was that if you had like a utility PPA in place, they would kind of put you to the front of the queue. Um, and nowadays, what they're doing is it's kind of first come, first serve. So when they're trying to figure out all the impacts on the grid from adding whatever the capacity is that you're proposing, they have to take that into consideration in relation to everything else that's been proposed and everything else that's already on the grid and operating.
Well, I'm just wondering what the effect of an IRA bill change is going to be, right? So you have an IRA bill. It's been around for a couple of years. You had a lot of applications to put power sources onto the grid. Some of them have gotten approved or close to approval. So you have this expected pipeline of capacity being added to the grid. And then if the IRA bill changes in the way it's currently proposed, where you have 6 months or 5%, or no, 60 days after the passage, you have to have 5% of the total investment already in the ground, so to speak, spent. Otherwise, it doesn't count, right? So then you're pulling the plug on some projects, I think. Doesn't that just completely just wipe out all the planning that has happened in terms of the interconnect over the last couple of years? That it really throws a kink in the works, right? I'm thinking about this correctly. It's playing around. I'm the electrical engineer on the panel, I think. Am I the only one that's an electrical engineer? Okay. So when you add capacity, it's not easy because you're adding reactive power. You got real power and reactive power, right? So you got transmission line. When you start adding transmission line, you have this inductive thing that's happening, and you got to balance it, or it doesn't work. You have big problems because you're not really moving electrons; you're moving magnetic and electric fields around, right? So you kind of got these waves going. It's electromagnetics. It's the electrons are just rattling back and forth in the wire to create these waves. That's what's providing power to the world at the minute. If we can't do that efficiently, if we don't plan it out, then you have problems. You have unevenness, and the grid doesn't like unevenness. One of the reasons maybe Spain disconnected from the grid was because of the unevenness, the frequency changes, the loads disconnecting. Bad stuff happens, and then they don't have power for 10 hours or whatever the amount of time was. That's a huge freaking problem. I don't think anybody has really thought this through. I'm okay if you want to pull the plug on all the $26 a megawatt hour. Okay, sure. But doing it at 60 days is too freaking soon. You're going to create problems. Well, going back to the Australia problem and now the American problem, you have to increase the amount of electricity on the grid, period. There is a certain growth rate. I think 3%, 2 to 3% is generally acknowledged as that growth rate. I don't know what it is exactly in Australia, but it's going to be somewhere close to that. If that's the case, you cannot be altering. You can't go from 3% to 1%. You're going to have problems 3 or 4 years from now.
Even if it's 0%, you're still going to have problems because the thing is, in Australia at least, our coal power plants are really old and they are borderline economic to run. Even an old power plant that's already paid, it's paid back all of the, capital expenditure. They're borderline to run, right? So they're all announced closures. As they get closer to their end of life, they're getting less and less reliable. And, it's one thing if, it's not windy for a little while and wind power turns down. That's something that everyone's planned for. With coal power plant, when that, that's a gigawatt all in one go. When that goes off the grid, that is challenging. Planned for, but it's a bigger deal. You start to see a few of those happen at the same time and your electricity system suddenly falls apart. So yeah, even if you want to just maintain zero growth, if you still want electricity into the future, you have to plan, and the planning today does involve replacing the existing coal plants with renewables. If you want to replace it with something else, something instead, then you need to do that a long way ahead of time. It takes longer to build a coal power plant than it does to build a wind farm. And who's going to pay for it? Then there's nobody interested. No private company is interested in building new thermal power plants in Australia because they're not economic. So it's not. You can't just simply say we want things to stay exactly the same. They can't. Your coal power plants are dying. You have to replace them. You can't just pretend that you don't need to replace them with anything because that's just not based on reality.
Yes. And so the argument that's being made at the moment, and going back to Rosemary's point about the coal plants, because that discussion is happening in the United States now, all of a sudden, we're talking about coal again, is that there's just a certain amount of load always on the grid. The coal plant just provides all that power that the grid demand doesn't vary up and down all day, which it totally does, right? So coal plants and gas-fired plants in general don't, nuclear, I'll throw into the mix, don't like going up and down, right? They like to be constant. But the usage is not constant. Is anybody talking about this? I don't get it. I mean, the duck curve is real.
I'm talking about it. We're talking about it. People talk about it, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure everybody gets it. Like last time I was at Queensland, I was up there, going to one of the big wind farms that are there. It's already there, already running, and I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was just driving onto site, and the turbines had been running, and then all of a sudden, it's like the whole wind farm slows down to a stop at 7 in the morning. The sun is barely up. So there's a small amount of solar. There's heaps of rooftop solar in Queensland because there's just so much sun. It just really makes money, and it takes like 3 years to pay back for your system. So what's caused that? It's because no one's using much electricity at that time of day. Coal can't turn down beyond a certain level. The rooftop solar also, you can't stop households from using their own electricity that they're generating. So there's just coal power plants are supplying more electricity than the grid needs, and so everything else shuts down. But the prices then they're negative. That means the coal power plants are paying to generate electricity. It's not like they don't get it for free. Sometimes they're paying negative hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour just to generate through the middle of the day, so that for a couple of hours in the evening they can make a few $100s a megawatt hour to generate. But now there's heaps of batteries coming into the grid, and they're going to reduce that evening price spike. So it's just like things are going to change even faster over the next couple of years.
And that was actually the one big pillar of Labor's proposal for renewable energy was, yeah, we're going to do transmission. Yeah, we're going to do more generation, but we need to have especially consumer-based battery storage systems with some type of maybe subsidy or some other type of regime that facilitates the adoption of that technology because in Australia, we need that to be able to take some of that power to basically eliminate that duck curve.
Yeah, well, the Queensland government has just cancelled all of the pumped hydro projects in the state as well. So, they're just nothing.
Why?
Because they just don't want anything, any of these green projects. They don't want any negative, negative effects from a new infrastructure project unless it's from fossil fuels. That's okay. You can have a new coal mine or a new expand gas infrastructure, but just don't do it for clean energy reasons.
But those devices are not meant to handle flexible loads. Coal is not meant to handle a flexible load. So what are you doing if you know you have a certain amount of fixed, or inflexible, we'll call it, and you have a lot of flexibility because that's the way the grid is developing at the moment. You have this flexible demand that you need to meet with something that you can turn on and off. So when they see wind farms being turned off, that's a good thing. The reason they're doing that is because the grid needs that. You have to turn those things off. Otherwise, you have grid collapse. You will damage the grid for crazy reasons by leaving too much power on it, feeding it, and not enough pulling it off.
And the coal power plants, they have to pay a lot of money for the fact that they're not flexible in that way. But you know what I think is really going to help is the Queensland government. I don't know if they had any incentives for household batteries, not that I've heard of, but the federal government has announced a 30% rebate. But I think that what's really going to change things is because rooftop solar has changed the way that the average person thinks about energy in Australia. Because once you've got solar panels on your roof, and 1 in 3 Australian households do already, then you've got a real economic incentive to use electricity when the sun is shining, right? It's the your feed-in tariff that you get for giving it to the electricity grid is not anything close to what you pay to bring electricity in. So everybody is naturally kind of incentivized. When you get household batteries, then it's going to just really boost the extent to which households can shift their demand around. Because at the moment, like if you're at work all day, you can't choose to do your, I don't know, dry your clothes in the middle of the day. And if you would hang them out probably on the line anyway, if you did. But, like there's only so much you can shift your loads around if you're out of the house during the day when it's sunny. But if you've got a battery, then all of a sudden households are going to be trying really hard to make sure that they are only relying on they're as energy self-sufficient as they can be. I'm not talking about going off grid, but I'm talking about, using mostly self-consumption. And I think that is really going to change how much, a non-friendly to renewables government can really bamboozle people, because they will get this understanding, of what it means and to what extent you can shift things around, to what extent solar plus batteries can supply the bulk of power, which in a state like Queensland is especially true. So I think the discourse should change over the next few years.
As wind energy professionals, staying informed is crucial, and let's face it, difficult. That's why the Uptime Podcast recommends PES Wind Magazine. PES Wind offers a diverse range of in-depth articles and expert insights that dive into the most pressing issues facing our energy future. Whether you're an industry veteran or new to wind, PES Wind has the high-quality content you need. Don't miss out. Visit peswind.com today. The grid stability is economic stability. That's exactly what it is. And I'm not an analogy person. As an engineer, I don't like using analogies, but I'll use this analogy because I think it applies to the United States and it kind of clears this up. When the U.S. started putting train tracks down, where are all the cities at? They're on the train tracks. That's where they are. When the U.S. started to put highways in, where did all the cities develop? Along the highways. When the Eisenhower administration went to this kind of the superhighway thing, right? So Interstate 95 and 10 and all those, where did all the industry and people move? Right to the superhighways. It's exactly where they are. If you're not on the electricity grid, if you want to isolate yourself from the grid, you are isolating yourself and your future generations from economic success and growth. You just are. So you want to be on that grid. You need to be near that grid. If you want your children and your children's children to have a life, they got to be near that damn grid. And if you make a grid that's unstable, like this happened in Spain and other places, it's not just Spain. I mean, Spain's the most recent case. When the grid becomes unstable, you become economically unstable. America cannot have an unstable grid. Australia cannot have an unstable grid. Canada cannot have an unstable grid. Brazil cannot have an unstable grid. And for some freaking reason, we don't seem to understand that when politicians get involved in this, and Joel pointed this out, when you start unplugging projects and saying we're going to fill this with some other sort of power source, that you're screwing with the economic viability of your community. That is what you're doing.
The average person that doesn't understand the electricity system well, it sounds more reasonable that a really constant outload, base load generator is more reliable. We all know it's not true. However, it's a simpler message. And that's why I say that as batteries come into households with rooftop solar, then they're going to understand how reliable variables plus batteries can be.
Rosemary, I think the average person will never understand that, which is why the politicians are not talking to that. And Joel, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the latest I've heard of the United States, and it's a little bit of a different argument. I think Rosemary's right on the technical side. Don't get me wrong. She's totally right on the technical side. But on the politics side, here's what I hear in the United States at the minute. Well, those wind turbines are ugly. What the hell does that have to do with the grid security? Nothing. Coal plants are freaking ugly. They are ugly. No one wants to live next to a coal plant. And that's why we're closing them down, because they are awful to live next to.
Yeah, it's a politically driven, but it's emotional versus technical, emotional, political, whatever you want to call it. You hear a lot of influence from all these things. Here's the opposite side of that. I think wind turbines are freaking beautiful. I think they look like works of art on the horizon. They're cool as hell. Some of the Alan, think about this. How many times you and I have literally pulled over on the side of the highway to take pictures at sunset together, like we're on a date?
We're not on a date officially, by the way.
We're not. Yeah, yeah.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
To me, they're beautiful. I think they're amazing. They're awesome. Right. So then it's just this emotional thought. You like them or you don't. It's the NIMBYism thing. It's the Nantuckets don't want to see it off the coast. But they don't realize that their energy future, their economic future is hanging in the balance of what they don't like to look at.
If you go to any Midwestern county meeting where they have, a community session talking about a new renewable project they want to build, that is precisely what ends up happening anyway, because all the arguments that people come in with are whatever they've Googled on the internet. And we used to have experts there, either from the project developer, and they still send their own people. But see, the problem is the community's like, oh, well, of course you're going to say nice things about the project you want to build. But what we also used to have were people from AWEA that had a network of grassroots folks that could go out and provide independent support during those kinds of meetings. We lost that grassroots when they pulled out and sent everybody into Washington, because that's where they think policy gets made. But it's not making the right kind of policy, because you need to be able to change people's minds in the local communities. And the lack of grassroots is what's killing the industry at this point, and nobody's investing in that anymore.
Let's be honest, have politicians ever understood how the electricity grid works, like in the, the electronics kind of way? No, the average person doesn't understand that. So we've, engineers, electrical engineers, power system engineers have got on with the job of keeping the grid reliable, despite a lot of challenges for, over 100 years now. And if we would let them get on with it, then they would continue to do that. But now electricity is political because of, climate change. And so that's why you have all these problems where people want to, mess with the way that engineers have always done things. So
SunZia, the largest wind energy and solar project in America at the moment, is being built right as we speak. It's about 3 gigawatts. All right, so plugging in 3 gigawatts anywhere is a big deal. No matter how big your grid is, 3 gigawatts is a lot of power. It's run into legal problems again, and maybe they're all justified. But if you take 3 gigawatts that are planned capacity that all of a sudden could disappear, or could be delayed by a couple of years, that's a big deal. And I think all the electrical engineers in the world would say, uh-oh, we got a problem here that we need to get fixed. And I think that is going to be more common now than it has been previously because of the size of the projects. The projects are getting massive. And so instead of putting in 50 megawatts, we're putting in 500. Instead of 500, we're putting in 5 gigawatts.
But is that so different to, like you've had, gigawatts or multiple gigawatts of nuclear power that turns out to take 20 years to build instead of 10, and that's the same sort of challenge. You gotta in your planning, people are obviously aware that things can get delayed or whatever. So I don't know if it's a brand new unique challenge. It's a challenge for sure, but I'm not sure that it's unprecedented.
I think the trouble that what you say unprecedented, I disagree with you, because when I hear, like, I'm sitting in the ERCOT market, right? And I watch what the ERCOT, like 2, 5, 10, 20-year plans are. Great. Looks like we're going to be fine. They were the ones who put in the crest lines, which are the big transmission lines to go west in the state to grab all the renewables and bring them to Dallas and bring them to San Antonio and bring them to Austin. Great. But they're being undermined right now by the politics, and the politics are literally quoting the DC politics and saying, like, they're standing up against renewables. And it's like, okay, whatever your political ideology is do you. But when you're looking at stopping growth, stopping energy generation of the only sources that are deployable fast enough, you can only build solar and wind and batteries fast enough to keep up with the growth and demand right now. We've said this before in the podcast, I can't go to GE and order a thermal generation. I can't order a natural gas plant and get it next year. I'm not going to get it until like 2030, 2032. if I'm lucky. And then by 2032, the demand in the ERCOT market is going to be over 2.5 times what it is right now. So you better start building wind and solar. So if you're passing legislation that's undermining the ability to do that, we're screwed. Like I'll go get solar panels and batteries for the house because you're going to have to have them.
Do states start to take over where the federal government is stepping away?
You can't if you cross state lines.
Whoa. In terms of development, Joel, I'm not saying in providing. Basically, and what I'm thinking is, if it's a $31 a megawatt hour production tax credit, and the federal government pulls it, which is the problem, they pull it, they bring it back, they pull it again. Okay, if I want to have some stability, and if I'm in Kansas and the electricity is being generated in Kansas by wind and solar and a bunch of other things, same thing about Iowa, I don't want that nonsense going on. I want them to know that the power is going to be there when I need it, because my economic viability is relying upon that. It depends on that to happen. So do I take the production tax credits and build it into my state somehow, either in terms of rate increases or subsidies from the state government?
The only way that they can pay for that kind of a subsidy at a state level is to raise prices.
Or taxes.
Or taxes, but probably raising rates is the easier way to make that happen, because changing the tax code means more state level, provisions need to be put in place. It's just easier to jack up the utility price. So that's likely the outcome if they go that direction. The reason why the industries pushed for federal, tax subsidies in the first place is that it provides a bigger, more economically viable pool to pull from for those subsidies, as opposed to leaving it up to the states, where states are then going to get into competition with one another, where Kansas is going to make their subsidy, $32, and then, Oklahoma is going to make theirs like 35, and then, which sounds good. I mean, it sounds like, okay, capitalism, yay, capitalism. But that's going to end up, but that's also going to end up having the same effect that you were talking about before, Alan, because somebody that was proposing a project, even if it's like, let's say it's somewhere in the Southwest Power Pool, even if you were proposing a project to be built to connect to one node, based on the inconsistency of the state subsidies, you may pull your project from one node and now want to stick it into another node because you're getting a higher subsidy over here. That's why a federal subsidy is actually better, because it provides more consistency to the entire industry, regardless of where you're building the project.
But it's a brave new world right now, Phil. There has not been consistency at the federal government level. It has been very, if anything, inconsistent, consistently inconsistent. So it's going to be consistently inconsistent, then the states are going to take over, or the utilities are going to take over and make it consistent.
So let me give you a rundown of states. And I'm just saying, for money to be able to possibly do their own PTC. These are the states in 2024 that ran at a budget surplus: Texas, Florida, and now it gets weird: Oregon, Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, South Dakota, Wyoming, Nevada. Wyoming, big wind state. Of course, Texas, big wind state. There's a couple of big wind states in here. The rest of them, solar, of course, you can put anywhere. Oregon's a pretty decent sized wind state as well. But I think you could see that. But I think you would, to what you're saying, Phil, I completely understand. Federal's better. However, if they're not going to do it and the states start doing it, great. But I think you would see some lawsuits instantly, because people would be like, and it's because the power pools don't follow state lines. ERCOT is the only one that is within one state, no lawsuits there. But if you're in Southwest, you're in MISO, you're in the PJM, you're anywhere else where that stuff can cross the electrons technically can cross state lines, then you're going to run up with a lawsuit. It'll get stopped up instantly.
I could see ways to structure it would work, where everybody would be happy. It's about time.
It would make investment in states competitive. Think about that. If you're sitting here in South Dakota and Minnesota's offering you $30 megawatt hour, all of those jobs are going to Minnesota. All those jobs are going to Minnesota. All that construction is going over there. All that spend is going over there. All that economic growth is going over there. That's as easy as it is.
That's exactly right. That is the railroad of the 2020s. It's exactly what it is. And if you're not willing to hop on that train, man, you're going to pay a price. And it's not going to be a 5-year penalty. It's going to be a 100-year penalty. That's what we're talking about right now. So get on this electricity train. But thank you for listening to this podcast. Hey, everybody's frustrated at the minute. We're all trying to figure out ways to make the electricity grid more reliable, more consistent, and better than it is today. So thanks for listening. This is the Uptime Wind Energy Podcast for Phil Totaro, Joel Saxum, and now the missing Rosemary Barnes. We'll see you next week.